28 trillion. That is the staggering number of possible deck combinations you can build in Clash Royale. Many of them simply don't work in competitive play, and the decks which do work largely belong to just 6 or 7 distinct deck archetypes. Let's walk through each of them in detail, analyze their strengths and weaknesses, and help you find the best possible deck archetype that suits your specific playstyle and aids you in reaching the big leagues. Number 1. Bait decks. Bait decks do exactly what their name suggests. They bait out specific responses from your opponent. In simpler terms, they force the opponent to play certain spells or defensive cards, and then punish them severely once that card has been used and is out of rotation. The most popular bait decks are Log Bait and Hyper Bait, which both revolve around baiting out low damage spells like Log and Zap. Once those critical spells are used up, the second wave of bait cards is placed immediately, forcing more desperate responses and often resulting in significant tower damage. The key to playing bait decks like a professional player is to play extremely unpredictably. Position your goblin barrel in different tiles and angles, and make it harder to predict. Wait on your skeleton barrels to bait out responses first, vary your timing consistently to keep your opponent guessing. The biggest advantage you have with bait decks is the exceptionally fast cycle speed. All bait decks have a very low average elixir cost, typically ranging from 2.6 to 3.3, making evolutions even stronger since you can cycle back to them rapidly. You can constantly force the opponent to make the same defensive plays, putting them into a predictable rhythm and allowing you to read their plays with increasing accuracy. The defensive potential is extremely high too, with cards like Skeleton Army and Goblin Gang providing immense value, making these decks very hard to break through even with substantial elixir advantages. However, these decks require extensive practice and dedication, and also keeping a careful track of your opponent's card rotation and elixir count. If you're a beginner, you need to be very patient to adopt this complex playstyle successfully. Make sure you don't give your opponent insane log value by clumping units together, and learn to defend efficiently with minimal elixir. Proper placement is crucial. A properly placed Goblin Gang can be entirely countered by a single log, wasting your precious elixir. Number 2. Cycle decks. Cycle decks are often even cheaper than bait decks, often featuring average elixir costs as low as 2.6 or even 2.4. In Clash Royale terminology, to cycle means to play your cards very fast and efficiently, working your way back to the specific card you want to play again as quickly as possible. The offensive attack relies heavily on just 1 to 2 key cards, and the rest of the deck's cards are primarily for cycling back to them while providing cheap but effective defenses. The famous 2.6 Hog Cycle deck perfectly embodies this philosophy. The Ice Spirit and Skeletons are used to cycle back to the Hog Rider as quickly as possible, all while simultaneously helping in creating cheap but effective defenses against opponent pushes. The strategy revolves around getting constant chip damage. Every small spell you play on the tower, every hog hit, every bit of damage stacks up over time. Keep the opponent constantly under pressure, never giving them time to build substantial pushes, and strategically outcycle their counter cards like cannon and bomb towers. These decks usually don't have any traditional tanks and rely almost entirely on perfect placements and precise timing. The skill ceiling is exceptionally high. With dedicated practice and extensive training, you can master these decks and dominate the ladder. However, for beginners, leveling up the cards is just as critically important as learning the proper placements and mechanics. Underleveled cards in cycle decks often result in your key cards dying before they get value. And when played perfectly with frame-perfect timing and optimal placements, cycle decks can dominate almost every other deck archetype in the game. They are the fastest and most extremely fast-paced decks, which the current meta heavily rewards with evolutions and heroes as well. The ability to cycle to your evolution twice before your opponent cycles to theirs once is an enormous advantage. Another giant advantage is subscribing to this channel to outsmart your opponent with big brain tips and support me as well. Number 3. Beatdown decks. These are the most traditional and classic form of decks, even recommended by the in-game deck builder pretty often. They are generally beginner-friendly to use, and following a similar set of fundamental rules will get you very far ahead in mastering these decks. Deck types. They have a clear structure: a tank, 1 or 2 support cards, and several spells. Tanks are high HP troops like Giant, Golem, or Giant Skeleton. They usually target buildings exclusively, meaning they ignore all troops and walk walk directly toward towers. Support cards follow behind and wipe out defensive troops, making a clear path for the tank to reach the Princess Tower and take it down. Spells compensate for the inherent weaknesses of your support troops. In the popular Golem Night Witch deck, the lightning spell takes out the Electro Dragons and Inferno Dragons, which can kill the Night Witch very easily and shut down the entire push. Beatdown decks center around building overwhelmingly strong attacks that are difficult to defend against efficiently. When the opponent overcommits, which means using more elixir to defend than was necessary, you punish them immediately by making massive, unstoppable pushes in the opposite lane or by building an even bigger push in the same lane. You need to develop game sense about when not to defend as well. Sometimes sacrificing a tower to build a bigger counter push is the correct play. Learning elixir management and when to trade tower damage for elixir advantage is crucial. However, these decks do have their significant weaknesses. They struggle considerably against quick cycle decks that can apply constant pressure. They're very slow in single elixir, which gives your opponents with fast decks ample time to damage your towers severely before you can build your first major push. They're also very matchup dependent. If you face a hard counter deck, you'd end up struggling desperately the entire match, regardless of skill. But these decks do shine spectacularly in 2x and 3x elixir modes, and they're relatively easy to learn the basics as well. The learning curve is much gentler compared to cycle or control decks. Number 4. Bridge spam decks. This archetype seems self-explanatory at first. You spam your cards directly at the bridge. However, there's more strategy than meets the eye. Unlike cycle cards, bridge spam decks are moderately more expensive, typically 3 to 5 elixir, and feature cards that move and attack very fast, like Boss Bandit, Golden Knight, Bandit, and Royal Ghost. The P.E.K.K.A. bridge spam deck has been a staple archetype for a long time, constantly adapting to meta changes. Cards like Royal Ghost and Bandit can be played aggressively at the bridge, and they need to be responded to very swiftly and precisely by the opponent. If your opponent chooses to defend them in the exact same manner every single game, you can outplay them significantly by making accurate predictions in subsequent games. These decks are relatively much easier to use compared to cycle or control decks. If you successfully force your opponents to make some defensive mistakes or misplays, you can secure huge positive elixir trades and significant damage on the tower too. The chip damage accumulates immensely in these deck types as well, as each individual attack deals substantial damage. However, the high offensive output makes these decks somewhat weak on the defensive side. They struggle defending against relentless cycle decks especially, which build constant and unending pressure against them. If your opponent successfully figures out your deck composition and rotation, it makes you very predictable as well, and they can prevent virtually all the damage you attempt to deal. Additionally, these decks often lack effective answers to large tanks, making beatdown matchups challenging. Number 5. Control decks. Some decks are not very straightforward like Cycle and Beatdown. They don't have very strong or obvious tanks, nor do they have clear cycle cards and win conditions. Their average elixir costs are moderately higher than Cycle decks, typically around 3.3 to 3.8, and they usually include a high damage spell like Poison or Fireball to help secure wins. They're called control decks for 2 interconnected reasons. You need exceptional control over yourself and your emotions to play them perfectly without tilting, and you can also control the entire flow and pace of the game using them effectively. The skill barrier is extremely high, and mistakes are absolutely fatal with this archetype. It is very hard to make a comeback from even a single significant mistake, especially if your opponent is experienced enough to capitalize on it. Decks like Minor Poison Cycle and Minor Control were extremely dominant in the top ladder several years back. Top players genuinely love these decks because learning these at an expert level basically transforms you into the puppet master of the game. All your opponent's plays become forced and predictable, turning the game fully into your favor through superior game sense and elixir management. These decks feature extremely strong defensive capabilities with great versatility, and they win primarily through accumulated chip damage over time rather than one decisive push. They're built perfectly for slow-paced, methodical games. Master these decks if you truly want to become a Clash god and understand the game at the deepest level. However, they do require enormous time investment and dedication to reach proficiency. Number 6. Siege decks. Siege decks revolve around using either the X-bow or the mortar as the primary win condition. The rest of the 6 cards are primarily dedicated to defending the siege building at all costs, and the 8th slot is usually reserved for spells as a last-ditch effort if your opponent keeps defending very well and you need alternative win conditions. The support cards are extremely strong at defending as well, featuring cards like Tesla, Knight, Archers, and Ice Golem. Similar to control decks, you can trap your opponent in unfavorable card cycles, forcing them to defend with suboptimal responses. Evolved Mortar and Tesla strengthened both these popular siege decks significantly, making them considerably more viable in the current meta. But these decks usually become very predictable in their patterns, and distracting the siege buildings using cheap cards like Ice Golem or Skeletons is quite easy once you understand the timing. You also need high-leveled cards to make these decks work effectively. Under-leveled siege buildings simply don't deal enough damage. Additionally, you need quite some practice specifically on defending efficiently, as siege decks often operate at an elixir disadvantage. However, the potential in these decks is very high when mastered, as they always require immediate counterplay by your opponents, forcing them quite often to overcommit elixir or take significant tower damage. The psychological pressure of an X-bow or mortar locking onto your tower is immense. And finally, number 7, DIY. Back in 2016, the game was all about creative deck building and trying different experimental strategies. DIY decks used to be very popular back then, and even now, if you wish to have genuine fun and experiment, this is definitely the way to go. Mash up different archetypes together and build something uniquely creative that you personally enjoy playing. Sneaky goblin decks, clone spell strategies, mirror-based decks, these are all quite fun to try out and experiment with. These decks have the crucial element of surprise in them when played intelligently. Your opponent has no idea what to expect, making it harder for them to make optimal plays. With many cheap cards, evolutions, and heroes now available, the possibilities are genuinely endless. And who knows, you might accidentally create the next dominant meta deck, which takes over every other deck archetype for that season. Many current meta decks started as experimental DIY creations by innovative players. The creativity and experimentation phase is what keeps the game fresh and exciting, even after nearly a decade of existence. Muhammad Light has been consistently destroying the CRL in his own style. Watch that master at play and learn from the GOAT in this video here, and I'll see you there.